But anyway, we want today to come to groups. Until now, we have talked about different things that were not involving groups. Last time, I'm afraid there may have been some challenging issues. Today, we are looking at something more everyday life related, namely intergroup relations. But before we start with this, let's look at these three figures. Are they a group? Can you talk about the three people as a group?
If they define themselves as a group.
Beg pardon?
If they define themselves as a group.
Okay, that's a good point. If they define themselves as a group. So, if they define themselves as a group, actually,
They should have one goal, for example.
they should have a common goal, but let's think a little bit outside. So if these were the inhabitants of the earth, of the whole earth, so everyone counting for 2 billion, would this constitute a group, the population of the earth?
To an outside observer, yes.
A very good point. Exactly, that's where I want to come to. It's not enough to be an ensemble of people as long as you don't have an outside number of people that are not related to yourself, to call yourself a group, or even for the scientist or for the sociologist to talk about groups that don't have a counterpoint outside. So what we always need is some outside people, but in the ideal case we need another group that confronts this group. Without a counterpoint group, it wouldn't make much sense to talk about the term or use the term group or social group in social sciences. So a group exists always as a group only, in contrast to another group. And let's now look at how groups come into being and how they relate in certain respects with each other. For doing this, we make a quick return to a topic that we, I think, briefly touched about biotechnology, at least in the seminar. Let's talk about cars and coffee machines. That's a car, that's a coffee machine, and if you're good in handiwork, you were able to somehow make a coffee machine into a toy car, because you can use the materials, you can shape them, reshape them, you can make new wheels to it, etc., etc. But what I want to say is that first, artifacts are determined by their functions. These are artifacts, of course. And these functions can be changed if we are good with our tools and we work on it. For example, we could actually make something like this out of a car and of an airplane, a flying car. But besides artifacts, of course, there are other beings in the world that are not artifacts, like this and this. And the question is, what about this? Is this an artifact? Well, it's not really one of the two other living beings before. It is a mixture of the two and creates a strange impression. That's what genetic engineering actually wants to do, wants to think about as just as a living artifact, so to say, in a genetic combination. But what we have, this strange feeling that we have looking at this, comes from a certain fact, but from the fact that we attribute to living beings, we attribute something like an essence that determines a living being to be a living being of a certain kind that has an identity that has certain properties, certain characteristics, etc. This essence is something that already children believe that living beings have, and little children already know that you cannot make a cat into a dog or a bird into a cat, because a cat is a cat is a cat, and catness cannot be destroyed, not even if you paint the cat like a bird or like a dog. So essences usually determine category membership of exemplars in an unequivocal way. So once we are able to attribute an essence to an exemplar, a living being, we know which category it belongs to. And the other way around, with living beings, once we know the category membership of an exemplar, we can tell a lot about the exemplar itself. We can tell about the properties, we can tell about their behaviors, we can tell about what it will be eating, etc., etc. So this essence is usually conceived, imagined as a stable cause of the phenotype that is discrete, immutable, homogenized, and homogenizes the category members. Nowadays, and I'm just repeating what I said in the seminar some weeks ago, nowadays we know that this essence, what the former people in the old ages called an essence, or the blood of a living being, is determined by what we call today the genetic apparatus. And the last important point is that once we project an essence onto an entity, onto a category, we are automatically actually naturalizing this category and the members in this category. But let's now look at this man and compare it to this man. They are both, of course, members of the human race, but they belong to different cultures. They belong to different cultures and to different social categories. The question is, how do we deal with these? They are not animal species, of course not, and they even belong, being both humans, belong to the same human species. But still, automatically, we have a tendency to attribute them something like a cultural essence, because, as already the old social psychologist Alport mentioned, we treat social or cultural categories very much like animals, or different animals, in a way that we attribute the Oriental Arabs, for example, the soul of the Oriental, we attribute Italians, the Italianness, meaning very outgoing, very talkative, etc., very funny. We know that certain states, countries, and leaders, like Hitler, was fond of what he called Aryanism, the essence of an Aryan people that gave rise to his ideal idea of a German. So Alport already mentioned something like this, and in the meantime, there has been a development of what we call psychological essentialism that helps us understand a little bit some of the phenomena that we need to explain in order to talk about intergroup relationships. So, sorry, I came somehow. So, what happens if we project an essence onto cultural groups? Cultural groups are social categories. If a cultural group is member or is part of a state where it forms, for example, a minority, cultural groups are very often treated in common sense understanding. in common sense understanding as possessing an essence also. So common sense thinking about social categories or ethnic categories maximizes in a way the intergroup differences. It homogenizes the differences between the members, the in-group members of this ethnic kind. And at the end, very often implicitly, it legitimizes differences between natural groups or between cultural groups as being natural. So in a way, essences, or the idea of an essence, the implicit idea of an essence, is an apparatus, a cognitive mechanism that helps us deal with differences between human groups. In a way, it is a cognitive tool, an epistemic tool at the end, an epistemic tool that allows us, or that is important to understand, social life and to deal with differences between social categories. It allows quick and easy closure. We see an exemplar of, let's say, of a Turkish person on the streets. You don't have so many here, but in Austria we have. And immediately you think you know what this person will do in his as a mealtime, as what he will be like in his family, how he'll treat his children, etc., etc. But by being such an important epistemic tool for our cognitive apparatus, it's also politically used, of course, and it's one of the big strategies of politicians trying to naturalize the differences between groups in a society in order to manipulate the people in a country. So as I said, this is a powerful cognitive tool for representing social categories, using essences, projecting essences on categories, on groups, that can be brought about by two things. Either by something that we call nominalism, that is by arbitrarily giving a name to a group of people, calling them the green ones, and another group the red ones, and then suddenly after a little time these two groups will start to dislike each other, as has been shown in so-called minimal group experiments by Henry Tatchell. The second mechanism would be naturalism. Once we think or have the common sense impression that the difference between two groups looks very, very natural, in this moment we also are attributing an essence to the members of these groups. All this has cognitive consequences for our thinking about the groups, particularly if we naturalize, we get the impression that the ethnic belonging or the ethnic characteristics of the members of a group will be very stable and very durable. They will not change quickly. So we apply this tool actually in different situations. First, we can apply it to outgroups, as I mentioned already. First, I must quickly discriminate between so-called forced social categories and chosen social categories. The group of journalism studies here, students here in this building, is a group that's not naturally determined, but that's chosen. The members of this group chose to become journalist students. The psychology students in the other building over there in the back chose to become psychology students. They are also a chosen membership group. And once we talk about, if we stay in Estonia, talk about the Russian minority and the Estonian ethnic majority, we are talking about forced social category. because the members of the Russian category and the members of the Estonian category could not choose to be there or there. They were just put into a group by birth. So we can use the tool of essentialism on the one hand from the outside to characterize and stereotype others, outgroups. We can use them for creating our prejudice on essentialist differences between groups. We can go as far as racism to say that they are have less value than we do in our society, for example. On the other hand, an in-group can use essentialist thinking in order to increase their identity, their social identity, their belonging, and their ideas of social inclusion and exclusion, to define who should be excluded from their membership in the group and who should be included. This has been called La Distinction by Bourdieu, this quite famous book on social distinction in societies. So let's now look first at the use of essentialist attributions from the outgroup towards another group. It has to do with stereotyping forced social categories. So I mentioned this. Forced social categories that are amenable for stereotyping are usually ethnically distinct from ourselves. They look different, and these different looks give us the opportunity to call them naturally different. And being naturally different allows us to attribute them further attributes that may not be immediately visible. As I said, I meet a Turkish man on the street, and I get some vague idea of how he will be in his house with his family, how he will behave. But if we know, for example, that another person is an Arab, and maybe it's by chance a female Arab wearing a hijab, such a long dress, we may, after the events during the last 10 years, have the faint feeling, okay, there could be a bomb underneath. This is called inference potential. We have the capacity to make inferences about further characteristics of the members of a social group. And it's no surprise that this particular kind of inference is being applied to immigrants primarily. Like in this cartoon. And cartoons are actually a good source for looking at or finding stereotyping, because cartoons like to use very strong stereotypes and prejudices that we encounter in everyday life in their presentations. For example, also in this one, where the inference potential of being an Arab allows us to infer or think that it's potentially a terrorist, particularly after the last ideas that or the last announcements that we got from the last crash, the airplane crash on the Sinai. Okay, we looked at an essentialist discourse in a neo-Nazi discussion forum. The neo-Nazi people are particularly likely to use essentialist attributions because they are very strongly concerned about differentiating themselves ethnically and racially from other groups. For example, from Africans or from Jews, etc. So we analyzed a discussion forum of such neo-Nazis. and looked at the different ethnic categories that were mentioned in them and the attributes that the people, the participants in this forum, attributed them, they gave them. And a topic that occurred very frequently together with Africans was related to German identity and to procreation. Here they are talking about African immigrants to Germany, and the neo-Nazis, the participants in this forum, were obviously concerned about Africans doing procreation with German women and of obtaining German national membership, nationality, a passport, so to say. So in a way, the participants in this forum did an essentialization, first on a symbolic level, when they refer to Africans not being able to become German citizens because of their African essence that cannot change. And second, on a biological level related to procreation with local women. Both are processes, or let's say political attributions, political categorizations that have to do with an essentialist thinking, even if the people don't call it that way. Sometimes they use the old-fashioned terms in order to talk about essence, like it's in the African blood that they should not mate with our women, for example. And the outcome of such a procreation would be a very poor bastard that has no identity of itself, that does not deserve to live actually in Germany. So actually a not very funny, not very nice discourse developing in these websites. Okay, until now we talked about attributing essence onto somebody. But of course, politically we can also go the other way around. And we may say that somebody does not possess human essence. And by withdrawing the person, the humanness, or the belonging to the human race, we are actually dehumanizing this person. And if we do this on a categorical level, if we do this on a collective level, we are actually, in effect, dehumanizing a whole group, which is a prerequisite for a lot of atrocities that we encounter in world history, and that we unfortunately also are able to encounter in recent times in our contemporary history. It needs no mention that Auschwitz is an example of that. You could never treat the Jews and the Gypsies and other Eastern ethnic Slavs, for example, the way that the German Nazis did at that time, if you did not withhold a humanness to them. So dehumanizing is an important instrument to make it easier to kill somebody or to treat him or her very badly. More recently, during the Vietnam War, there was this My Lai massacre, among others, that's committed by some US troops. That was also possible, as we saw from interviews with participants, soldier interviews, because they saw them not anymore as human beings. The villagers that they killed en masse in this attack, even though there was no trace of any Viet Cong or other enemy they were searching for. We have other examples, and this example, for example, is one that I was pointed to by a PhD student from Indonesia. He was working on stereotyping of religious groups in Indonesia and Indonesia we have particularly two Muslim, how shall I say, groups. One is the dominant Sunnah Muslim group, the other one is a minoritarian Ahmadiyya Muslim group. Ahmadiyya was or is a person that gave rise to a sect within Muslim religion that is still existing in many countries, but it's always minoritarian. And the Sunni Muslim majority is very much against the Ahmadiyya group, because for them they are heretics and they need to be removed from this earth because they are betraying Allah's will. But how do you remove somebody from the earth if he or she is being thought about in an essentialist way, naturalized way? I mean, somebody that you imagine as being naturalized the way he is or she is, for example, being Ahmadiyya follower, there is no way to convince him or her to become a Sunni and leave the Ahmadiyya group alone. So, unfortunately, there are events that occurred only a few years ago. And somebody who doesn't like to see bad things should look away or close the eyes now with this movie. Can you imagine to do something like this to another living being, a human? And this was not the only victim. Just unbelievable. And the police is standing around. They're looking. They're not doing anything. Only at the end, they give a little bit of a signal to stop, as you can see here, and to stop this terrible behavior. It's always very sad to see this, for me at least. And these are things that were not happening 100 years ago, 200 years ago. This was just 5 years ago. And it goes on and on and on, and it's not quite recently, has not been the only atrocity that we are observing recently. No, we have the IS, Islamic State things, where they decapitate their victims, their prisoners, just because they belong to the wrong religion or to the wrong army groupation. Or just 2 weeks ago, we had this event in Beersheba in Israel, where the onlookers of a supposed attack, a knife attack on an Israeli committed by a Palestinian, thought that this person was one of the perpetrators, and he was not killed, but at least shot at by the policeman. He was wounded, lying here, and the people standing around started lynching him, kicking him by the feet, with their feet, etc., committing things that you could not do to a person that you do not withhold humanness. So humanness, attributing or believing in the humanness of the other, is an important psychological behavior or trait that we should always follow in order to prevent ourselves becoming lynching people. So, if we summarize, stereotyping the outgroup usually involves essentializing it. It involves attributing it immutable attributes that are attached to a certain ethnic essence, and that allows us to have something like an inference potential when we know the category membership of an individual, of an exemplar. Then we think that we could infer what he or she has as other characteristics. And the opposite of this cognitive strategy of essentializing is withholding an essence by making a human dehumanized that allows me to attack it in a very cruel way. Constructing in-groups. We said essentializing can be a cognitive strategy to address my stereotyping behavior against another group, or it could also be used by the in-group in so-called identity projects, where in-groups construct their identity in chosen or forced membership groups. We found, for example, this thing here. The military group, the US military group of the Marines, is a group that is characterized by strong how do you say, spirit of the corps, you know, of spirit of being part of an elite group in the US Army. And they develop an essentialized self-understanding of their identity and of their belonging to the Marines. So their standing slogan is exactly this, that says primarily that once you are a member of the Marines, there is no way to shed your membership, to shed the essence of being a Marine that has been attributed onto you or endowed onto you during your becoming a Marine, during your training. So what's happening here is a symbolic transformation. Once you make or attribute yourself an identity that is at the end essentialized, you are creating a perceived much stronger homogeneity among the members of a certain essentialized group. Something that in psychology is called entitativity, or an entitative group. A group, as we have seen in the first graphic example that I had at the very beginning of my talk, is a collection of individuals. As long as we see a group as consisting of individuals, we are fine. We are not entitativity. We are not thinking in terms of entitative units. But entitativity would mean that we attribute a collection of an ensemble or a mass of individuals as a shared group boundary that makes them to an entity themselves as a group. So the group, the entity is no more the individuals that form a unit, but the category itself is becoming a thing that we can talk about without problem. So this transformation is made much easier once you work cognitively with the idea of essences. And accordingly, Henry Tetchfeld defined social identity as that part of an individual's self-concept which defines his or her membership in a certain group. Although Henry Tetchfeld was not yet talking about psychological essentialism, his theories allow us to implement the approach of psychological essentialism equally well. I don't know who of you knows the minimal group experiments that we mentioned at the very first, in the very first introduction here, this term, where I just quickly repeat. It's funnily enough if I go around here and I give to 5 people of you here a band that's green, that's red, for example, and to 5 other people a band that's blue. And we just observe what you are going to do once you have this attribute. what's going to happen is that after a while you're going to get together, all red ones go together and start talking with each other, thinking that they are something special. The blue ones get together, start talking with each other and think that they are something special. And in that instance, you have already two groups that start to develop stereotypes about the other, to devalue the others. And not only the others as a group, but also the members of that. So it's a very deeply inborn, ingrained in our cognitive system, in our, let's say, even evolutionary heritage, that we tend to form groups and to use the slightest characteristic that allows us to categorize two groups that we will use, particularly if this characteristic is in contrast to other individuals or to members of another group. Yeah, for example, yeah, sure, this self-essentialization and the formation of identities, social identities, usually goes by way of different strategies, different ways. For example, we can develop certain ways of greeting each other to signal that we belong to the same group. It's usually said that Freemasons, for example, have the greeting ritual that only they know and nobody else recognizes. We may develop an idiom, a certain dialect within a group in order to underline and emphasize our identity. We may, of course, give us a group name that allows us to talk about ourselves as a unit. And if the group foundation is important enough, we are going to develop something like a foundation myth. Usually countries have foundation myths in all of the world, and even Estonians, I was told, have a foundation myth, which is the heroic freedom struggle 1,000 years ago, I think, wasn't it? Or 800 years, whatever. There was a freedom struggle, and this freedom struggle, even if it was not very successful, gives us something of an idea that allows to understand ourselves as members of the Estonian ethnic group. So that's an example from many European universities where we can see that fraternities and other groups assemble and use this cap, as it is called in German, Käppi, to distinguish themselves. We know that Muslim women sometimes use this way of distinguishing them from other women. We have students, at least in Austria, that dress very properly, I must say, particularly those who study economics and feel themselves already being a manager or something. So they distinguish themselves by using suits and ties. But it's not always only this kind of groups that are just illustrated here, but it's usually also minorities who have a necessity or a tendency to self-essentialize. Why do they have this tendency? They feel the need to essentialize themselves and their ethnic characteristics because they are under pressure. They are under pressure by the majority's assimilation attempts. I mean, Austrian society would be happy if the Turks living there after 3-4 generations already, if they finally assimilated to become Austrians, oh God, to eat pork, to drink beer, wine, etc., etc. But these Turks resist these assimilation tendencies because they understand themselves in a very essentialized way as being Turks, by definition, by identity that cannot be so easily changed. By resisting assimilation pressure, minorities preserve their social standing as a minority with a certain number of rights, for example. And it creates group cohesion, and of course, as a consequence of cooperation, it creates also group efficiency if they have a problem that they must face or cope with as a group. So we made a study in Lithuania, the southernmost Baltic state, where we have a dominant Lithuanian ethnic group and a minoritarian Polish group that lives together, particularly in the eastern part of Lithuania. And what we did here was we conducted focus groups by 6 to 8 people of ethnic Lithuanian composition and 6 to 8 people of primarily Polish composition in different places in Lithuania. Because in Lithuania we have the funny thing that a little bit similar to Narva in Estonia, where you have a dominant, where we have a minority that actually locally becomes a majority relative to the ethnic Estonians that live in Narva. And we have the same structure in the eastern parts of Lithuania, where the Poles suddenly become in certain regions a majority, a numerical majority that is bigger than the nominal majority of the Lithuanians living there. But anyway, we analyzed the discourse that developed in the focus groups according to attributions, ethnic attribution, essence attributions, etc. And what we found, and as expected, was that the minoritarian Poles, irrespective of whether living in a city or in the rural areas, has the strongest tendency to self-essentialize their Polishness, whereas the urban Lithuanians had much less tendency to self-essentialize their identity, whereas we see an increasing tendency with Lithuanians who live in these numerically Polish-dominated regions in the eastern rural parts, in order to follow the general tendency that we can observe with minorities all over the world. But the numbers are quite strong, and we can see that Poles, being in the nominal minority position, have primarily the first and strongest interest in self-essentializing. Self-essentializing, as said, is a response to an identity threat by the majority. And we looked at this not only in Lithuania, but also in Austria and in Estonia. And we asked them some questions about their tendency to self-essentialize, and we found that the minoritarian Russians showed a stronger tendency than the ethnic Estonians. And in Austria, we looked at Austrians and Turks. There we also observed that the Austrian majority had a lower level of self-essentialization than the Turkish minority, which again illustrates the effect of coping with identity threat. Identity threat is one thing for a minority. The other is discrimination. Minorities very often run the risk of being discriminated politically, economically, and in other terms, and discriminated in their freedom of executing their rituals and their religious cults. And there was 6 years ago a referendum in Switzerland about minarets, and the Swiss decided, or a majority of Swiss decided that that mosques should no longer be built with minarets because that's too obtrusive, too much of a competition with the Christian churches. What we did with this referendum was we looked immediately after the referendum. We looked at websites, forums of discussions among Muslims, and there are many different Muslim groups who maintain discussion fora. And some of these forums are more radical, more Islamist, if you want, and others are more secular, more, let's say, more liberal in a way. But we look particularly at one that is the Al-Usuna group and discussion forum here, and looked at how they talked about this referendum in Switzerland, this blatant discrimination of their religious rights, so to say. And what we found was a strong emphasis of their identity ideas, of how they characterize their identity, their being Muslims. Well, first, the Islamists have a strong idea of being part of the Ummah, which is the group of the believers, and not of some particular national country. They always referred to the Ummah and not to the country of origin where they were coming from, and always stressed and emphasized that countries and nationalities and ethnic belonging should not play an important role for a Muslim. So they exhibited a strong tendency to entitativity of their Muslimness and of their Muslim Ummah group. There was an ongoing essentialization process going on in the discourses that we analyzed here, particularly by always referring to blood bonds that were supposedly existing between the members of the Ummah, like brothers, sisters, etc., blood relationships that were, of course, symbolic because they were not part of the same family, but even the symbolic reference to blood gives them the feeling of a shared identity, of a shared natural belonging. And all these tendencies were much stronger after the fact of the discrimination, after the Swiss referendum. So if we summarize, the consequences of essentialized identifications are that once we attribute essence either in terms of stereotyping or in terms of self-identity, is that we naturalize the difference to other groups, that we are involved in boundary making, we create boundaries, and boundaries, of course, give rise to exclusion. And we emphasize the immutability of the attributes that are our determining identity attributes. Okay, so far so good. But there are situations where some groups may not be happy with their being attributed an essentialized stereotype or identity themselves, because a certain social structure or social condition may give rise to discrimination exactly because the group is being thought about in an essentialized way. And this may give rise to what I call politics of de-essentialization. One of the most widely discussed the last 50 years, widely discussed groups that perceived, were the activists of the group, perceived a problem with being attributed a natural essence are women and the group of the feminists. In vernacular understanding, so everyday understanding of the people on the street, men and women are different by nature. They belong to naturally different categories, which every single look at the auditorium confirms, of course. Women look different, are different than men, and sometimes they also behave differently. But this blatant or emphatic, let's say, difference in natural characteristics may be a problem for attaining equal rights. So in comes feminism, and feminism has the goal, developed the goal not only during the last 50 years, but also 100 years ago with the suffragettes and other groups that worked for women's rights, to de-essentialize the everyday understanding of women and of men, particularly by changing the discursive understanding of men and women and bring it away from discursively talking about biological sex to talking about social gender, trying to determine or let's say influence the public discourse about men and women in a way that does not anymore emphasize biological differences, but emphasizes more the social differences. So what we observe here is the political goal of feminism is at the end nothing else than an attempt at de-essentialization, de-essentializing the difference between the genders. By discursively eliminating this idea, and the propaganda has been ongoing. You need to do propaganda, of course, for this legitimate goal. Has been ongoing on different levels. So the goal is, if we are successful in de-essentialization, the goal is to making a vernacular category, an everyday understanding of men and women different in everyday thinking and everyday discourse by denaturalizing the difference. Another example is the tendency in the USA of politically correct changing the name of the descendants of the old former slaves in the southern states, the black Africans. For many decades, so many, actually even a century long, this group of people has been called the blacks, in contrast to the whites. But if we're referring to the color of the skin, you are actually making a biological distinction, because skin, of course, is a biological fact. And then some 20 years ago, the intention came up to change this term in public discourse to African American instead of black. So by changing the discursive use or reference to, how shall I say, black people, in terms of a geographical difference, African American, instead of a biological difference by skin color. Okay? The question is, of course, if this de-essentialization attempt is successful, if the geographic, if the biology is replaced by geographic descendants, because then we have, if you look at the USA, we have a group of African Americans, we have a group of Asian Americans, we have a group of Latin Americans, the Mexicans and all the South American people who immigrated to the US. And then we have the Caucasians, the Americans, that do not need an adjective in order to be characterized, which again is a little bit unequal.
I just want to say that actually one problem also is that white people who are coming from Africa and going to America, they're so labeled African Americans, but you know nobody believes them because everybody knows that if you're African American, then you're supposed to be black. So it's not actually a geographic, you know, in people's minds.
I'm not quite sure I understand your argument.
There are real cases where
You mean mixed
people from Africa who are Caucasian
South African Republic, so almost
go.
Okay, South African Republic, there are also white Dutch immigrants, and they actually would be categorized, if they immigrated to the US, they would be categorized as white Americans.
Not
Of course.
necessarily.
Well, if they're mixed, of course, like in apartheid, they would be immediately called black or, let's say, African American. But the tendency of this discourse was primarily to achieve symbolic equivalence between the different groups that exist in the US. You wanted to say something.
You can also create or construct additional categories like European Americans or Native Americans.
Native Americans there are, yes, but the, in quotation marks, the regular whites, so to say, rarely talk about them as European Americans. They talk about the Americans, even though they are the secondary immigrants after the native Indians, for example. What I want to show with this is that there are, in many places, we can observe tendencies or an interest, a political interest to de-essentialize the identity, perceived identity of certain groups. Then there may be the opposite case. For example, there may be non-essentialized groups that perceive a political disadvantage by not being essentialized. So if you are a member of a not essentialized group that identifies itself or that is being identified from the outside as being an arbitrary group, can become a problem, particularly if you want to achieve some political influence, some political rights. And the possible remedy to make this situation better is to self-essentialize. Just as the feminists try to de-essentialize the female and male groups, some groups, in this case particularly homosexuals, have a political interest to essentialize themselves. At least 10 to 20, 30 years ago, there was a strong tendency within the politically active homosexual movement to self-essentialize. In vernacular, everyday parlance and everyday thinking, homosexuality is perceived as an individual sexual preference, no? With, by many people on the street, perceived as being sexual practices that they don't appreciate. So 50 years ago, parts of the homosexual movement had the idea of, okay, let's self-essentialize. Let's make us an entitative group that has a biological reason to exist as they are. So they tried to follow a policy of changing the stereotype from an arbitrary groupation to an essentialized groupation that has natural reasons to be as they are. So there was a very extended search for neurological, for physiological, for anatomical differences between heterosexual and homosexual people. And there were even, of course, some results and some differences found that were eagerly taken up by the politically active part at this time and used to self-essentialize them in the perception of the outside. And by doing this, they naturalized their behavior, which gives them another standing in political life, which gives them a more power, negotiating power, so to say, in political negotiations, leading at the end to the last 5 years discussion in Europe about being allowed to marry in many countries. Another example of self-essentializing politics are the well-known aristocracy in modern times. Well, after the First World War, the European aristocracy, and I must say Austria was one of the quickest to do this. They threw out all aristocracy, particularly the emperor and his children and his wives, because he was thrown from the throne and had to give up all his possessions in Austria, and he was relegated to another country. The same happened to much of the aristocracy because they were not anymore allowed to use the terms and the words that they used to distinguish themselves from common men. For example, in German we use the term von somebody. Von, and after this von follows a geographic term, for example. We have the same use of the von in Germany very strongly and in Holland. But in Austria this was forbidden in order to equalize the social distribution of aristocracy and common persons, so to say. But of course, members of the aristocracy have an interest in maintaining in power and distinguishing themselves from the others. So they did everything during the last 100 years to underline the blue blood by furthering something we call the yellow press, where all the different activities of aristocracy in Europe was being reported in a positive way. And they wanted to distinguish themselves from the new rich people who became rich and strong and powerful just by economic engagement. They also had a tendency to not acknowledge national differences between European parts of the aristocracy by seeing themselves as a group above any European national boundaries. And we all know, of course, in connection with the aristocracy, that they have strong endogamic rules. So ideally, being an aristocrat, you should not marry a non-aristocratic person. It's easy if this non-aristocratic person is a woman, but it's nearly impossible to marry for an aristocratic woman to marry a non-aristocratic man. That's nearly impossible. There may be exceptions, but the basic rule in these circles is to stay separate in biological terms as well as in symbolic terms. And also certain structures or certain conditions of minorities or certain, let's say, minoritarian groups have an interest to de-essentialize once they perceive themselves as being threatened by an outgroup in a very serious way. Then they start to de-essentialize. For example, as a certain part of the Muslims that we analyzed on the discussion forums. As I told you, we analyzed 8 different discussion forums. One was this Alusona extremist forum. The other one was a very secular forum where so-called normal people from Turkish descent, but Muslim religion, were discussing things. And many of them actually expressed a desire to de-essentialize themselves, not to become visible anymore as immigrants. So there are certain political conditions that allow or that make it opportune to shed or to negate one's identity. I do have a nice example actually from a study we did on Muslim women in a minority in the majority position. This study was done in Indonesia, where Muslims are a majority, and in India, where Muslims are a minority. And we interviewed them why they are wearing a veil, why they are veiling themselves. And one of these women expressed this dilemma very well. She was very well integrated in Indian society. She had friends from the Hindu side. They were making friendship meetings, they had festivities, etc., etc. So this woman says that she was always considered one of the non-Muslim people, the Hindus, but actually I always knew that I belonged to the Muslims. And although the majority never targeted me or discriminated me, I felt hurt. Because even if my friends knew that I was a Muslim, they would say, but you're not one of them, you're one of us. But the woman, of course, was a Muslim. And she started to feel like a bit of a cheat. Why was I lying to them about my identity? And so she started to contemplate the idea of wearing a scarf to discriminate herself and to defend herself from being assimilated. And by this she thought that why should I not attempt to break the stereotype of what a Muslim is? So Muslim women with a scarf are not always uncultured, analphabetic, poor creatures, but they may also be educated and well educated women in a good job. So if we summarize this, changing one's stereotype by some propaganda campaign, maybe either aimed at self-essentialization or by self-de-essentialization. By essentialization, we want to achieve the formation or the discursive confirmation of an essence that implies also a natural difference between us and the others. By de-essentialization, we want to achieve a discursive elimination of an essence. We want to denaturalize our category membership. And all this together is called essence politics. But there is a consequence or a prerequisite of essence politics. And this essence politics presupposes that people mutually know each other's attribution or essence attribution tendencies. Meaning that stereotyping processes and social identity processes are interrelated. Because in-group people react towards a bad out-group stereotype and try or attempt to change it in order to gain a better political standing. So we must presuppose that stereotyping and prejudice processes are related to identity processes, that people know in a way each other's images that they maintain. Let's look at the Estonian case with the Russians and the native Estonians. You have seen this graph. And additionally to the self-essentialization, we asked both members of both groups of how strongly they think that the other group is self-essentializing. And we found this. The Estonians were aware that the Russian group was self-essentializing themselves much more than the Estonians did for themselves. And the Russians were aware that the Estonians were much less self-essentializing than the Russians did to themselves. Yeah? And we observed the same pattern in Austria with the Turks. Yeah, go ahead.
Was the scale the same in both questionnaires?
Well, no, the scale was different, and the numbers are the result of some standardization procedures, etc. Okay?
What did you actually ask?
We had 3 items that referred to essentialization. One was trying to explain what we understand by essence. They're saying that there is a certain belief that social groups or ethnic groups have some underlying characteristics that cannot be changed, that are stable, and that determine their so-being, more or less like this. A second item I read, an Estonian will always be an Estonian. It cannot, also in the future, cannot be changed. Or a Russian will always be a Russian. And another one was similar to that formulation that I cannot recall exactly how it was written. And altogether gave us the essentialization score. And what this really shows, and what I want to show is much clearer here in the Estonian case, that the mutual essentialization is very much in accordance with the self-essentialization of each group. So, which means that their perception is very acutely correct, actually, to a certain degree. Okay? Another prerequisite of essence politics is as I said, the mutual interdependence of identity and stereotyping. And this actually is a surprise to me that in textbooks we still observe different chapters for stereotyping and another chapter for social identity, and the two are not being related to each other, even though they have, in psychology, they can be considered complementary processes in a way. But I think here we don't have psychologists in the group, do we? Oh, she. Okay, and you. Okay. A minority. So be strong in self-essentializing. It's being different from the sociologists or whatever, the journalists, etc. Okay. Yes. So just to stress and to summarize, mutual interdependence of identity and stereotyping is necessary to allow identity management by in-groups and identity management under threat, under identity threat. This we saw in the response of the religious fundamentalists to this blatant discrimination in by the Swiss referendum. This we saw by the interview results from this traditional Muslim female woman in India who started under a certain condition to self-essentialize because she wanted to react against the assimilation that was happening from her Hindu friends. So just a last illustration of how this relationship between stereotyping and self-perception can happen. Just imagine a certain in-group behavior. For example, if we have an in-group that has as a rule to help each other in-group member, to help, to be solidary, to be solidary with them. When they have a problem, you give them support. And when somebody is without work, you give work to them if you have some information. This is a very positive behavior. It's very humane to help others and to be in solidarity, united together as a group. But of course, this positive behavior, if it occurs in a minority, is perceived from the out-group in a negative way, because from the out-group, this positive in-group behavior appears as nepotism and of discriminatory against the members of the out-group. And these things actually strongly happen with certain groups. One is the gypsy groups that are across Europe, well known for being very restrictive on the very exclusive, so to say. They don't allow others to come into their compounds, etc., into their group structures. And of course, they have a strong helping behavior towards each other. The other group is the Jews in certain constellations who have a tendency to self-essentialize on the one hand and also to maintain a strong networking activity among themselves in order to exert positive group level influence and support. And both these behaviors, as when seen from an outside majority, appear as negative, particularly as nepotism. So what this example shows is that interdependence of in-group and out-group may appear as negative, actually as negative, something that is, when seen from the in-group, as being something positive. To come to the conclusion. The idea of psychological essentialism allows us to understand certain processes in stereotyping and identity construction. And the two in a society are not independent, but they are interrelated. In a way, identities and stereotypes are co-constructed and depending on each other. Because from the inside perspective, you have other necessities, other wishes, and other political goals than from the outside, from the out-group. And all this together helps us describe certain aspects of intergroup relationships. I don't want to say that psychological essentialism and our presentation here explains everything of intergroup relation. It does not, of course. No social scientific or psychological theory explains everything. But it explains to a certain extent phenomena that are relevant in a society that do carry a certain significance. And this was the only goal of our series in this respect. Thank you very much. So you're allowed to comment, to ask questions. I give you the permission.
Can we think a man and wife that diet as a group? We need
That's a good question. Yes, it's yeah. It's certainly a group, culturally defined unit. Sorry?
Family is definitely a group.
Family, yes. Yeah, that's what he was asking. Yeah, a family is a group, but a very special one. And there are so many cultural rules and rituals and other things attached to family and to marriage, that we shouldn't straightforwardly compare it to other social or ethnic groups. Okay? Thank you.